Hello and welcome to Amazing Meetings. This is a show for the people who want to make a difference in the room.
We want to make sure that if you're standing in front of a room or leaving a room, that the impact and the effectiveness that you leave as a facilitator is something that will have a long-lasting legacy.
My name is Bartosz and I'm a learning and development expert based in Poznań, Poland.
My name is Louis. I am an executive and life coach based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
We invite professionals from different walks of life to share the tips and tricks.
Today's episode is all about asking the right questions at the right time.
I wanted to say thank you for this topic, Bartosz, because in coaching and in training, a question is one of the best tools we have to elicit information from the person sitting in front of you or the audience that we are trying to convey information to.
So for someone who's new to coaching, let's imagine you're in the middle of your coaching session and I walked into the room. What would I see?
Well, it really depends. So you and I, we normally do our meetings over Skype, and that's one of the ways. It's two people in a private room or in a private conversation. There's generally a coach that has a specific role assigned and responsibilities assigned, and the coachee who has come to the table with a specific outcome. I would like to talk about my procrastination or my ability to handle conflict. And around that topic, some questions are then being asked. And I might ask a question, and you will get back to me with some information that we then delve deeper into.
So it is my understanding that the coach does not have the answers, only the questions?
That is a very important thing to know and understand. I think as the difference between coaching and training is really understanding that you are a person specialist if you're a coach, and you are just there to get the knowledge and the skills and experience that the coachee has to bring that to the fore. Whereas a trainer, many times we have an existing body of information that we need to transfer. And the way to do this, to really transfer it in a coaching situation, as well as in training, is to use questions, and more specifically, powerful questions.
Today on the show, we have Craig Howe, who's a leadership coach specializing in working with emerging leaders. He holds CPCC and PCC credentials from CTI and the ICF, respectively.
Craig, it's exciting for us to have you on the show. With all your vast experience, we're happy to sit at your feet to see some of the wisdom that you are going to share with us today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, guys. Welcome and glad to be here.
Craig is based in the UK and works as an associate for Lever Learning in Australia, Sounding Board Incorporated in the USA, and Eluminas in the UK. Craig has worked with over 400 clients in more than 40 countries around the world, amassing over 680 coaching hours to date.
So, Craig, just to get us off started, seeing that we are talking about questions, when we do coaching, questions is one of the most powerful sources and resources that we have. What are some of your go-to questions that you will generally ask someone in a coaching session just to kind of see where they're at before the conversation gets started?
So it's an interesting question, Louis. I wouldn't say necessarily that I have go-to questions, because I think that each individual is different. And even though you might be having a conversation with the same person over the course of several weeks or months, what's relevant in that particular time can be completely different. But I think the key in a powerful question is making it something that's really relevant to them. And so I always try to ask open questions, things that maybe begin with a what or a how, rather than that are going to lead into sort of a yes-no type answer. And generally for me, I'm trying to pick up on something that maybe they've sort of shared in the information that they've given, and I'm looking for that sort of opening to step through to just really try and go deeper and to really explore. So for me, that's kind of my go-to, is it comes from curiosity and just really sort of getting under the skin of what it is that they're sharing with me.
All right, so you have about 680 hours of coaching.
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about your journey. What made you become a coach, which is, for us, the questioning profession?
Sure. I mean, I think questions is one, as Louis said earlier, one of the most powerful tools that a coach has at their disposal. I guess for me, my journey began towards the end of a 20-year career working for 4 large international banks, to be honest. I'd kind of got to the stage of feeling quite burnt out. I didn't really feel appreciated, and I literally felt like I was leaving half of myself at the door each day. So I went on this transformational weekend workshop, and after just 2.5 days, I literally felt like my life had changed. So I got really curious about how the guys had facilitated that, and it turned out that they were both coaches. So that really was the sort of the motivation for me to want to find out more. I'd seen such poor leadership in banks and the organisations I'd worked at that I actually felt there was room for a more diverse type of leadership and a more all-encompassing sort of approach. And so coaching felt like a great way for me to be able to sort of start to enable that, really. So I was quite fortunate that fairly early on in my coaching journey, I managed to get an opportunity as an associate coach working for a company down in Australia. And the main advantage that's given me is that in a relatively short space of time, I got to work with a huge number of leaders in countries all around the world. And so the 680 hours is one thing, but I think what makes me different as a coach is the fact that I've worked with more than 400 leaders in more than 40 countries.
So Craig, just on a weekly, on a daily basis, what would your diary or your day look like?
So one of the joys of being a coach is that, to be honest, there's no commute. My office is at home. I just stagger down the stairs with a cup of coffee and I'm good to go. And that's quite helpful, bearing in mind that sometimes I start as early as sort of 7:38 in the morning for clients in locations sort of like Japan. And my work day can continue all the way through to sort of 8 p.m. for those clients based in the US. So I have quite a broad range of different time zones that I cover. And my day varies. So I have sort of 3 days where I do sort of 8 or 9 till sort of 5, and a couple of days where I start later at 10 and work through till 8, so that I can actually get that coverage for all my client base. And if you look at a sort of a typical day, that can be anything up to 8 different clients. My maximum for any one day has been 11, but most of my calls are either using Zoom or telephone. Very infrequently, there is some sort of face-to-face coaching.
So how do you manage your attention span on a day like this?
It's quite interesting that actually I schedule in pauses between each client, because it's really important that I process what's come up during that session, that I actually have a time to sort of record my notes, to sort of, I guess, clear, ready, so that I'm arriving with the next client sort of good to go.
So, and do you also prepare your questions in advance of the coaching session?
For me, I'm much more intuitive. So for me, it tends to be what's coming up in the session. However, the only sort of slight shift to that is if something's come up in a previous session that might still be sort of in my mind that I don't feel we really addressed properly, I might have a couple of questions noted down just as go-tos to sort of start me off.
Craig, you mentioned in being intuitive and being able to speak to the person in front of you. Have you got a story of where your intuition played a good role and another way where it didn't have the solution that you had in mind?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the examples I think on the positive side, bizarrely, a family member had recommended a client to me, and it was someone that she worked with. And she just wasn't convinced that the guy was kind of fully on board. And so she recommended coaching with me. A couple of sessions in, I kind of had a similar sense that there was a bit of a debate going on. So I just called it. I went with my instinct and said, look, I've got a sense that you're still attached to your sort of your former employer and your former role. And he really struggled to sort of evaluate the differences between the two different options that he saw as available to him. So at that point, I brought in a metaphor. And that really, in his mind, absolutely crystallized the choice that he faced. So the way that I approached it with him was just to say, look, you're with a small sort of management boutique company. I see that a bit like a super yacht. You're like nimble, you get involved in everything, you can go wherever you like. It's really upmarket, but basically you're getting your hands dirty in a lot more different areas. The alternative to that, where you came from, is like this luxury liner. So you're a very specialized role. You play a very specific function, but that ship ain't turning anytime soon. So it's part of a well-oiled machine. Which are you? And literally, I could visibly see the penny drop. And so he made the decision in that moment. I'm a luxury liner kind of a guy. And so that was the decision he made. He left the company that I'd been sort of approached by to coach him. Makes for an interesting conversation afterwards, but it was the right decision for him. I think, to give an example where maybe it hasn't worked so well, sometimes your intuition will bring up something, and maybe the label that you attach to that is wrong. So I might call it one thing, and the coachee might say, well, actually, no, it's not that. But nearly always they will say, but it's this. So your intuition typically is pointing to something. You may label it incorrectly, but the coachee will correct that for you, and you still get a great insight from it.
I must say, just in reflecting on what you just said, that's where the powerful questions actually come in so much. Rather than making a statement and saying, this is the way it is, to actually use the question in that way is a more effective way of approaching that situation.
Absolutely. And for me, the key to a powerful question is that it's based from curiosity. So we put our assumptions to one side, we put our expectations to a side, and you're actually really looking to explore. What is it that matters to that person? How is their thinking shaping how they're sort of engaging?
So Bartosz, I just want to reflect on what Craig just said. As a facilitator, many times when we stand in front of a room, we have the information. We're the knowledge specialists, and we're working with a group of people. And there's a question that comes up, and many times we come as the senior knowledgeable person. We want to be able to give the answer, and we want to correct, and we want to guide. Whereas the coaching approach in that situation is specifically what Craig said, is to have that sense of curiosity and say, but where does that question come from? Why are you asking the question? And to kind of get the answer from the room, if at all possible, which is more, there's more involvement from the room to be able to do that, rather than a facilitator standing in front trying to claim his space to say, you know what, this is me, this is the answer, you're right, you're wrong, I'm the guy that you're supposed to listen to. Bartosz, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. For me, this is the single biggest struggle of a facilitator. And I think the biggest hoop for me to jump through, historically speaking, detaching myself from the expert position. So, Craig, I think, in your journey of becoming a coach, you must have had some method, some way of improving your questioning skills. Would you like to share what it was?
Sure. So I think something that I learned very early in my coaching journey was incredibly helpful, and something that I still use now, which is to listen back to the calls that I've had with clients, to listen for where questions have really resonated, where they've literally stopped the coachee in their tracks, and where maybe it hasn't landed. So by listening back to the recordings that I've made of my sessions from a sort of supervision perspective, that's been really helpful at helping me to hone that skill. And one that's sort of slightly left field, I also give a deal of sort of gratitude to my mother, because she's an amazing person at asking questions. And she always gets to the nub of the matter. And so I also feel that she's played a key role in me becoming a better questioner.
Sounds like an amazing source of inspiration.
Absolutely.
So, but coming back to your client call recordings, what verbal or non-verbal cues are you looking for to locate the moments when the penny drops?
So it's quite interesting. Visually, there can literally be a sort of almost a leaning back. There can be a sort of almost a gasp, even, because you're asking them something that they're not expecting. Things tend to slow down. There's often some kind of pause, and you can literally see the cogs turning. It may sound a bit strange, but it's literally that visceral. And so for me, that's the real sign that something's really landed with someone. There's just this sort of slowing down of time, a really deep processing, and before there's any kind of response.
So Craig, if you had to give us a couple of tips of just how to incorporate more questions either into coaching or into facilitation, what are some of the things, some tricks of the trade that we can incorporate into our questioning?
So I think for me, some of the key things are, first of all, keep the questions short. One of the things I hear a lot of coaches do is they'll ask a question and add another question and add another question to that. And you're like, well, what actually am I asking here? So keep it short. And actually, I've seen a practice that's advocated 7 words or less.
Wow.
So that's quite a challenge to build that skill. I think the second thing is, once you've asked the question, leave room for the answer. Don't be afraid of silence. Give space for the person to process and really think about what it is that they want to share. And lastly, I think picking up on something I said earlier today, there's this piece around just get under the skin of any assumptions that are being made on the part of the coachee. What perspective are they bringing? And is that sort of valid or not? So actually by challenging their reasoning, that can open up a whole different range of sort of opportunities, of choices, of possibilities. So for me, I see that piece a bit like an onion. You take away the top layer, you're faced with another. Then you take that layer away, you're faced with another. And you just keep going deeper and deeper, because at some point you're going to really get to what the crux of the issue is. And it's often not what the coachee might imagine it is at the outset.
I just want to reflect on something you just said, and that's all about the silence at the end of the question. And I think so many times we want to bail people out to not be in that uncomfortable situation, or maybe they've misinterpreted the question, and now we almost want to answer for them because we're seeing this is really something uncomfortable for them.
Absolutely, but that's sort of where our assumptions are coming in, because we're thinking, oh, they're uncomfortable, they don't have an answer, and actually that may or may not be true.
So what do you do to fight those assumptions? Because I imagine it is a fight, and at least it is a fight for me.
And that's where I guess for me, having worked with such a diverse range of leaders in so many different places has been such a help. Because I can't assume that any two of those individuals are the same, because they've got completely different life experiences. And even though they may be in the same role, in the same company, they're completely different. And so that for me is always what I check at the beginning of the session. I check the person that I was sort of working with before, and I start with a clean slate, and I'm really trying to connect with that person in front of me now and what matters to them.
So let us check our assumption. I assume that I know what the word assumption means, but can you give us some practical examples of some assumptions that you've experienced or that's ripened in the market that coaches and facilitators should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so I mean, a typical assumption might be that everyone operates at the same speed as me. And actually, often what I find with high achievers is that their pace is markedly higher than their colleagues, and that leads to a great deal of frustration on the part of their colleagues, and perhaps frustration on the part of the coachee as well, because they're like, well, why are they taking so long? So that's a really sort of simple example. I think the other thing can be about the level of detail that's provided. So if you're familiar, for example, with the DISC styles, certain people who are much more analytical and detail-minded will want to know, have all the I's dotted, all the T's crossed. They'll want to know every last detail before they're ready to take a decision. Whereas typically, some of the sort of the more red characteristic leaders just want the highlights, and then they'll ask you if they need more.
So Craig, I want to ask, when we're talking about assumptions, I mean, Craig Howe is sitting there. He's having a conversation as an individual, and you're bringing your frame of reference, your experiences, your knowledge, skills, and experience to the conversation. There's other things being put on the table. What's the relationship between your knowledge, skills, and experience to speak into that situation and the reality, in inverted commas, that the other person might be experiencing?
So I think that's where you have to sort of check your ego a little bit here, which is, yes, I've got a lot of experience now working with different individuals, but that doesn't make me right. And actually, I always come back to curiosity. So if I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself, I stop myself, and I get back to asking those open questions, because for me, those powerful questions are really, they're like the key to a door. And once you open that door, you've got a whole room to explore that is really important and significant for that individual. And it's just finding on that bunch of keys which is the right one that's going to give you access to that space.
Let me take one step back.
Sure.
Because, Louis got me really interested in Craig as a person now, all of a sudden. So we're not in the room anymore. We're not in front of the room, but we are actually developing our skills as coaches, facilitators, managers. So for all of our listeners out there who are now at the point of deciding maybe where to go next in their career, or maybe how to develop their skills in a way to succeed in the respective fields, do you have any questions that you asked yourself that help you get where you are currently?
So one of the questions I ask myself is, who am I? And it's a really difficult question to answer, because that kind of changes, and it changes based on my mood, it changes based on what feels important to me at that point in time. But I find that really helpful in terms of ordering my thoughts. What do I want? Is another way of just sort of checking in with where I'm at and where I'm looking to get to. What's next? Again, it's sort of looking ahead in terms of what kind of direction am I wanting to aim for, and what sort of mini step can I take that's going to move me in that direction. So those are sort of some of the examples, and I think one of the others might be to sort of say something around sort of, how am I feeling today? Because how I'm feeling can influence the way in which I engage with that particular coachee.
So let's get really practical, Craig.
Sure.
If we're talking about questions, how can we incorporate questions into our everyday life? As a manager, as a facilitator, as a coach, as a husband, how can we use questions more effectively to get to maybe a different outcome that we initially anticipated?
So I think it really starts that questioning and listening are linked, they're inextricably linked, in my view. If we're no good at listening, our questions won't land. If we put too much emphasis on the question and don't listen to the response, you're going to keep dropping the thread or breaking the chain because there's no flow. So actually, the two together, I think, is the key to sort of successful coaching or any other sort of relationship development, really. And I always remember that sort of description about the fact we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so it should be 2 times listening to 1 time speaking. And actually, the job is get out of our own way, really put the emphasis on the other person. And before we jump in with our solution or our ideas or our thoughts, get really clear about what the other person's perspective is first. Because then when we're offering something, it's much more likely to be relevant to how they're looking at the situation.
So one question from me, I suppose, for digging a little bit deeper into that,
Sure.
is what do you do when you find resistance on the other end?
And that comes up a lot, right? Because I might be ready to go somewhere and the client might not. And so I guess one of the key skills that I've sort of developed is what we call calling it. So actually just saying to someone, I'm noticing some resistance here. Is this somewhere that you're ready to go yet or not? If not, what do you want to do with this? So not just trying to sort of skirt around it, not trying to be sort of disingenuous about it and finding another way. Give the coachee the choice. Are they ready? And they may say, look, it's feeling uncomfortable because, and that may give you another angle, but I think it's really important to sort of honor them and give them control. So picking up on something Louis said earlier, I think perhaps the difference with facilitation and coaching is in the facilitation space, as you say, typically you're sort of the specialist, you've got the knowledge, you're wanting to impart that to the audience, the participants. In a coaching relationship, I see it much more as a partnership. I'm not the expert in their life, they are. But my job is to guide them and to ask the right questions that help reveal to them the blind spots, what they don't know, so the unknown unknowns, and just starting to increase that awareness. That's really the key.
Well, that's amazing. So you're saying that just by acknowledging the resistance.
Yes.
You're already dealing with it.
Yes. Because actually, I believe the beginning of any change is awareness. You can't become unaware of something. So once you know you're resistant to that, then you can explore, actually, what are my reasons for resisting that? What's underneath that? So we're back to the onion. You take away a layer, then you reach another one, and there might be some resistance there too.
So Craig, so how do I proceed from being the person that I am now to being an expert questioner?
So I think one of the key ones, Louis, would be to, I guess, begin to develop an awareness around what your hooks and triggers are. What are the things that grab you? So you then get like laser focused in on a particular thing. So you might, for example, love rugby. And the moment anyone goes into South African rugby, you're off on one. You've got your favourite players, your favourite teams. So you're in this whole story. So when you know what things really light you up and really grab you, those are the ones to be careful of, because then you're going to get in your own way. So by developing that awareness first, you're more able to prepare when those topics come up to say, okay, I know I've got a potential here to go off down a rabbit hole. How am I going to stop myself doing that? By getting really curious about the person in front of me and how they're looking at this, because it will be different to how I'm looking at it.
So what happens if the answer that you're given is not the answer that you were prepared for?
Great. Because it's an opportunity to be curious about why it's different. What's the gap? Try and get into what that gap is. I'm looking at it this way. I see that you've got a different perspective on this. That's really interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, it sounds to me like there's at least two layers here. So being aware of the content, of the answer, and of the process as well, right? So
absolutely. So the other thing that you're listening for is, so in my training, we talk about level 1, level 2, and level 3 listening. Level 1 basically means I'm in my head. I'm in my own story. I'm doing rugby because they've mentioned rugby and I love rugby. Level
Springboks,
2 is
I'm
actually...
Here we go, yeah.
Springboks, there you go. Level 2, I'm over there with the client, but I'm kind of really focusing much more on the sort of the content and what it is they're saying. Level 3 is listening to the whole space, body language, what are they not saying, and really picking up on what I'm sensing rather than just the words.
So what is it you do to get yourself on the third level?
Slow down and let go of feeling like I have to get anywhere. Because where I am right now is the most important place to be in this moment. We often think, I've got like a 30-minute session or a 45-minute session or a 60-minute session. I've got to get an outcome. No. Just if you're really in the juicy content and it's revealing stuff to the coachee, that's the place to be. And the actions will come out of that naturally. You don't need to force it.
Bartosz, I just want to react to that. Specifically, if we're talking about a facilitator, I think that is such a unique approach to take, even when we are presenting content. It's that whole thing of we've got 5 chapters to get through today, or we've got a specific outcome to hit at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and something almost explodes just before lunch, and now you need to make a call of, are we going to delve into that, or are we going to stick to the program that we have? And it's that negotiation skills that you need to have with yourself as a facilitator, but also to be able to have the authority and say, guys, we were going to discuss chapter 4 and 5 this afternoon, but I can see something is happening here. And like Craig said, to be in that moment, to be able to give to the audience for that specific session the best possible outcome that they can have.
And I think just sort of picking up on that a little, Louis, I guess in my experience these days, the reason there's so many external coaches now is because managers perhaps don't have the skills or the time, typically, to provide the support and even the listening that their teams need. And so when a lot of coaches arrive with me, most of all, they want to be heard and they want to be witnessed. And so really taking that time to be with them where they're at, not where you'd like them to be, is really valuable to the individual. And that means more to them than perhaps anything else. Because you're really making the effort to get on the same page as them And the questions that you ask really show that level of awareness, because often your question will build on something that they've shared. So the other part that perhaps I haven't been as clear about yet in terms of questioning is, for me, it's trying to find that that thread. What links the different things that they're sharing with me, and what is the narrative that I'm starting to develop, and what does that mean?
Your advice resonates very deeply with me as we are here. And when you said that the question should not be longer than 7 words, I actually started going through the questions I usually ask people. Most of them are 12 words at least. Right?
Yeah.
So when you said you need to take your time, it was almost like a paradigm shift for us, because in facilitation world, we are all timed, and if you deliver a material, it's all timed,
sure.
And you have 7 minutes for the introduction. And if somebody breaks down during that introduction, you'd better be able to pick up the pieces and move on with the material. So I think for most of our listeners out there, it's going to take a lot of thinking to actually be able to unpack this idea and understand how powerful it is.
And there's a bit of a paradox there as well, which is interesting, because what I'm saying is to slow down, but then I'm saying ask shorter questions. So you're actually creating even more space by, first of all, slowing down, and second, by asking shorter questions. So that may make it feel even more uncomfortable to start with. But it's kind of allowing that room to develop, because then it's a bit like you open the door to that room, right? It's an invitation. Are you going to step into that space, and is now the time to go into that room? Or is it not the time? Is it time to go to the next door because that's more important for you today?
I think in facilitation we use questions many times actually to buy time. You get asked a very difficult question, and while you're processing the answer, you're like, well, Bartosz, you asked the question, what do you think? And then while Bartosz is talking, you're kind of processing to come up with the answer. And the value that I've gotten from this conversation today is not to just buy time with that, but really to use it as an opportunity to be able to say, okay, but let's really delve into this. Let's really come to an answer, or even to a more poignant question about what we're discussing here and what the outcomes might be.
So there's a certain progression or a certain logic to what we've established here, and taking into account the 3 levels of listening. Are there any resources, any materials people could refer to be more aware in terms of how well their questions resonate with the audience?
I don't have anything off the tip of my tongue, but I'm sure that if you did a Google search, for example, on listening, there will definitely be things that talk about the 3 levels. But I think the key really is to just check yourself. Are you listening? Are you So I guess for me, what sort of sits underneath sometimes is, why am I asking this question? Is it to give me an opportunity to talk about my experience, or is it genuinely focused on the other individual and understanding them better? Because that's really where we want to be. And like in the example you gave just now, Louis, you get the opportunity to ask the participant to sort of share some of their thinking that's helping them reach this particular perspective. Then you have the opportunity to widen that out to the group and say, so who else thinks about it this way? Who has a different perspective? And then you're really engaging the whole room, rather than just focusing on this one particular individual who may have a dominant point of view and feel that theirs is the only way.
I just want to respond to that, and something that I heard the other day. One of my friends went for coaching, and the remark was, oh, the guy didn't tell me anything I didn't know. And on the one hand, that's actually a good outcome of coaching is, well, you didn't share anything new. We just helped uncover more of who you are. And as we saw today, the questions is the thing. It's the scalpel that actually cuts through those onion layers to actually get to the heart of the situation.
Yeah, and I think that's a fairly common misconception, that people are going to show up, I'm going to do coaching to them, they're going to leave with all the answers, and they won't have had to do a great deal of work. The key to a good coach is the opposite, because I actually want them to be working, and my job is literally like 95% of it is questions and getting them to explore the things that they don't want to look at.
Well, this is essentially the outcome we want to have in a training room as well, right? Where there are the different ways of delivery and different means of actually getting there, right?
Absolutely.
But I wonder if we were to get out of the classroom, office, the meeting room for a moment.
Yeah.
Because we're focusing on us as people, as persons, as individuals. So I was wondering whether there are any coaching skills that you use every day. I mean, not necessarily doing your groceries, right? But
do you know, you'd be surprised? No, I mean, but literally, I'm a naturally curious person. I've always been since I've been a boy, and for me, it's just this natural, instinctive curiosity about people, because I know that everyone out there has had a different life to me, and so questions are like little windows into their world, which I find endlessly fascinating. Now, I'm sure not everyone's like me, but like when I meet someone for the first time, I want to find out about them. I want to find out what makes them tick. I want to find out what have been maybe some of the things they're proudest about. And when you really ask a question that shows someone you see them, just watch for the impact, because it literally will stop them in their tracks, because this isn't what we typically do. We talk about the weather, we talk about their job, we talk about where people are going on holiday, none of which typically matters that much. If you say to someone, what do you find most fulfilling? You're onto something, because you're really asking for like a window into a soul. If you had one day left in the world, how would you spend it? Then you're really going to start to get under the skin of what really matters to that person.
so is it something you would ask a complete stranger?
What, the last question?
If this is your last day on Earth, what would you do? Kind of sounds like hi, I'm a serial killer. I'm giving you an opportunity to give me an answer.
It's not the first question I'd ask across the grocery counter in Sainsbury's, but no. But it's like you build up to that. So there's also this sort of, I guess the other thing that's interesting with questions is you develop a trust between you and the person. So you start with maybe some of the easier things. And then if there's the willingness from the other side and they're sort of opening a bit more sort of widely, you might go there and you push a bit more. And you'll know when you've reached as far as they're comfortable to go, because they'll let you know. But don't decide for them. Give them the opportunity.
But the word you just used there was the word trust.
Yes.
And when we're asking questions, it's being allowed to actually answer that question. How do you establish or build that trust with coachees, with strangers, with the people in your life? How do you actually create something, a space where they feel safe enough to give you the answers to the powerful questions that you're asking?
So it's quite interesting that in coaching, typically there's a very conscious stage up front, not something that we typically do in broader life, where we design our relationship. How is this going to work? What do you need from me? What do you not want me to do? What do we do if you get stuck? So you've kind of put some structure around how you're going to be together.
Right.
You imagine if we did that when we first met our partner, for example, how much easier life would be. But we don't do it. So it's kind of, in that relationship, it's quite straightforward. With people perhaps outside of the coaching relationship, I think it just comes back to that sort of listening and to just pick up the signals from them in terms of how fast or how far they want to go. And if you're getting some resistance, check in. I'm picking up this. Does that mean you're done here? You don't want to go any further?
If I make the statement to say that being listened to is one of the best indicators of trust, is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely. Because I think, and also, so let me add to that, layering on top, listening without judgment. So listening in a way where the person genuinely feels heard and they don't feel criticized, or that we're listening with an agenda. We're just listening.
So the agenda behind a question is one of the, I imagine, common mistakes.
Sure.
Junior interrogators, interlocutors, I suppose, make, right? I'm looking for the right word. I was thinking, okay, who is Craig? He's a master.
Be careful what you answer here.
So I guess, okay, coming back to my question. So what are the common mistakes we make when asking questions?
So I think we've touched on two already. It's worth repeating them just to sort of for clarity. One is asking too many questions back to back. Second would be not leaving enough room. I think third, being in our agenda, not the coachee's agenda. I think fourth, maybe having like this destination in mind, which I've talked about. I think for questions really to work, they must come from curiosity. And it must be wanting to find out more, really putting yourself over in the shoes of the other person and really trying to get into their head and their heart and their gut in terms of how they look at the world. Because I think it's our thinking that most often gets in the way. And when we can reveal that thinking to someone, their patterns, their beliefs, their behaviors, their habits, that's when it really gets powerful, because they often don't do that to themselves. They don't explore how they're regularly showing up.
I think the challenge that we have as facilitators is that we have a much stronger agenda when asking questions.
Yeah.
We know the answer that we want to help them realize or get to.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask guiding questions.
Yes.
Do you agree? What about this?
Yes.
And kind of guiding them towards an outcome
Yes.
of realization that we have predestined. And what I'm hearing now specifically with regards to coaching is it's an open field. It's a roadmap that hasn't been drawn yet.
And I think to add to your point, Louis, there is a degree here of the time and the expectations around coaching that are very different to facilitation. So with facilitation, you have a destination in mind. In coaching, I don't know at the beginning of the session what that may be, because a coachee could arrive and say, here's my topic. We dig a bit and we actually find out the topic's entirely different. So the destination, if we'd created one at the beginning, would be wrong. But I guess it's that coming back to trusting the coachee or the participant in the room to know what it is that they need and to know where to go.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. I bet this is a major takeaway for some of our, people who need to stand in front of the room and make a difference. There's a lot of pressure there in that very moment where you need to say goodbye to your own agenda. Yes. And really hand it over to them. So there's a lot of trust that needs to happen. So we're aware of your time constraints today, so thank you for being here with us. But do you have any final thoughts or ideas you would like to leave our listeners with? So
there's a couple of quotes which I just think kind of sum up my views around leadership and some sort of, some good takeaways. So this one is by Rosalind Carter, and it's that a leader takes people where they want to go, whereas a great leader takes people where they don't want to go, but ought to be.
Wow. Okay.
And so for me, that's one of the things that I think is really important. It's leadership takes courage. And sometimes we have to trust ourselves that we know actually enough to sort of encourage someone down a path that they might feel apprehensive about or unwilling about, but that actually the payoff for the coachee to go down that path is worth it if they can stick with it. And then lastly, this quote's been attributed to Oscar Wilde, but I don't think it's necessarily proven that it was him who said it, but I always love, be yourself, everyone else is already taken.
That is brilliant. Might have been Albert Einstein, though.
You never know.
That is a lovely quote. Thank you very much, Craig, for your time. So tell us a little bit about what is it you do that you would like to show the world. Tell us how to find you. How do people find you?
Sure. So I basically offer a range of coaching packages to sort of leaders and also to coaches perhaps earlier in their coaching journey who are committed to their continuing growth and development. The best way to sort of reach out to me is by email using me at CraigGHowe, that's HOWE.com. I'd be more than happy to sort of get into a discussion with you about your needs. You can also check me out on LinkedIn. So there's a detailed profile there that sort of tells you a bit more about my career background. And if you want a bit of fun, I'm also a keen photographer. So on Instagram, my name is Himagery, Himagery, and that shows you, I guess, my different take on the world. So my tagline is see differently, and that's what I encourage my clients to do.
Craig, I have so many questions about that, but thank you for the time that you've given to us today.
My pleasure. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thanks for the opportunity, gentlemen, and I wish you all the best with this new podcast.
It was our pleasure, and you will find Craig's details and Instagram handles in the show notes below the episode on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you take your podcast from.
Well, Bartosz, a really interesting conversation we had with Craig, all about powerful questions. What's some of the takeaways that you had from our conversation that we had?
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway was the length of the question and how short questions can actually matter more than those long-winded, never-ending sort of information diggers, right? So I think we've, as facilitators, at some point we're all guilty of asking these never-ending questions that would freeze the crowd. So I especially enjoyed Craig's 7-word rule, which makes questions really nice and sweet and is a good test whether you're going the right direction or not with that. What about you, Louis? What was your main takeaway?
I think for me, again, it's the question of curiosity. It's understanding why the answer is being given, why words are being used, or even in a training situation, if someone is raising their hand and asking a question, the go-to might not necessarily always be to give the answer, but to be more inquisitive and say, but Bartosz, why are you asking that question? What prompted you to want this specific piece of information? And when we delve into those type of conversations, suddenly the learning just becomes a lot deeper than just saying, well, you wanted 1 + 1, I'm going to give you the answer is 2. Whereas if I understand the context, I can really help you understand the concept in a much deeper way. So the curiosity was the thing for me.
Wow, thanks for that. You know what I'm curious about, Louis?
So many things.
So many things, but among the things that I'm curious of is like, when's the next episode? Or who's our next guest? And I guess our listeners are also curious how to reach out to us and ask all those burning questions they might have on their end.
So we really want participation from our listeners. So if you have a question that's even longer than 7 words, but if you've got a question that you would like us to delve and find a specialist on, to maybe give some context or give some really deep, meaningful answers to you as a professional facilitator or trainer, please contact us on the website and make sure that you send us an email or a voice note, and we can make sure to give the information to you in upcoming episodes. So until next time, we hope you have an amazing day.
And I hope you have amazing meetings.
From South Africa, this is Louis signing off.
And from Poland, this is Bartosz signing off.
Bye.